Now let's turn our attention to swap contracts. Let's start by asking the question, what is a swap contract? Well, a swap contract is a derivative in which two counterparties exchange cash flows, which we often call legs, over a period of time. Often, one leg will be a fixed payment, while the other will be a floating payment. Here we have an example, a visual example of a swap, where two counterparties are swapping three payments. The floating leg is represented by the wavy line. The fixed leg is represented by the straight line. One payment will be swapped on January 1st, 2020, the next one 6 months later, with the final one on the maturity date being the expiration of the swap. Let's look at some of the aspects of a swap contract in more detail. There are typically 6 major components to a swap contract. First of all, we need to understand what the underlying asset is. It could be, for example, a fixed coupon bond, a floating rate note, or an equity. Next, we need to know the notional amount. The notional amount is not normally paid or received by the counterparties. Instead, it is used to calculate the cash flows that will be swapped. Next, we need to know the maturity date. The maturity date outlines the period over which cash flows will be swapped. It can be anything from 2 years to 10 years. Next, we need to know the fixed and floating rates. The fixed rate will be set at the start of the swap, and it will remain fixed for the entire term to maturity. The floating rate, well, for an interest rate swap, for example, it will normally be based on 3-month, 6-month, maybe 12-month LIBOR, dependent on the frequency of the payments. Lastly, we need to know the payment frequency. Payments, for example, on an interest rate swap are typically made either quarterly, semi-annually, or annually. The most widely traded swap contracts in the financial markets are plain, vanilla interest rate swaps. An interest rate swap swaps a fixed rate of interest for a floating rate of interest. Two counterparties enter into an interest rate swap with one counterparty paying fixed, while the other counterparty pays floating. The amount of these payments will be calculated using fixed and floating interest rates and a notional amount, let's say $100 million, that is not swapped. Interest rate swaps are often done to take advantage of different comparative borrowing rate advantages of the two counterparties. Let's now add some numbers to the previous example to see how this works. Let's imagine Company A and Company B agree to swap fixed for floating interest rates on a notional value of $1 million. Let's assume the term of the interest rate swap is 2 years, with interest payments being swapped every 6 months. The fixed rate will be set at the start of the swap, and that's set at 5.25%. Let's also imagine that the floating rates on the swap, assuming we're looking back, are now they're set at 5% for 6 months, but in 6 months from now, that will increase to 5.2%. In 12 months from now, it will be 5.3%. And in 18 months from now, the 6-month LIBOR will be 5.4%. We'll build a small table now in Excel. Let's build a table that shows the payments on an interest rate swap. Our inputs are in blue font. The notional amount of the swap is $1 million. The fixed leg is 5.25%. We're going to pay the fixed leg of interest every 6 months, so I've put here twice a year. The floating leg is based on LIBOR, and the floating leg payment frequency is also every 6 months, which is why I've put a 2. In practice, it's quite common for the fixed leg of an interest rate swap to be every 6 months, whereas the floating leg is every 3 months, so we'd enter the number 4 here instead of 2. We're also going to assume that 6-month LIBOR starts at 5%, but every 6 months is changing. Now in practice, we would only know these rates at the end of the swap or as we approach the following 6 months, but let's just assume those are the LIBOR rates over the swap. We're going to start by working on the fixed leg, starting in row 25. Then we'll move to the floating leg, and then we'll talk about the payments, because payments between the two counterparties will always be netted off. So we talk about the loan value of $1 million being the notional amount, so it won't be swapped. In practice, it's not swapped because what we do is take the loan value, which is $1 million, and the loan value on the other side, which is $1 million, and swapping them, and I'm just going to take one minus the other, is going to just lead to 0. At the end of the swap, it would be like we are swapping the loans back. So I'm going to just do Control C and V. The mistake I made here was I forgot to lock down my referencing. So I'm just going to hit the dollar signs with F4, get those dollar signs in there with F4, and then I'll recopy that. So academically, we can argue that one counterparty is swapping a loan for another loan, but in practice, those loan amounts, because the notional amount is always set to be the same, are going to cancel each other out, and no money related to the underlying is going to be transferred. Now in 6 months, we know that the fixed leg needs to pay interest rate at 5.25%. So here's our 5.25%. And I'm going to lock that down by hitting F4. However, that is an annual rate, and it's also referred to as a nominal rate. So to get the 6-month rate, we only have to divide it by the payment frequency, which in this case is 2. And that's C13, and I'll lock that down. But then we need to multiply it by the underlying notional amount, which is $1 million, and that's C11. And again, I'll put dollar signs there to lock it down. And I'll copy that down. And you can see each payment for the fixed leg is going to be 26,250. Now let's look at the floating leg. The floating leg, the interest rate is going to change. So we're going to go, it's going to start at 5%. But we also know that the payment frequency is every 6 months. So we're going to divide that by 2. I'm not going to lock down the C18 because I want that cell to move, but I do want to lock down the C15 with dollar signs so that one doesn't move. And I also need to multiply it by the notional amount, which again, I need to put dollar signs there because I don't want it to move. And I'm going to copy this down. And all I need to do now is look at the differences between the two. And it's the net payments that will be exchanged between the two counterparties. We're going to finish this Introduction to Derivatives course by looking at one more interest rate swap example so that we can see the benefits to both counterparties of entering into an interest rate swap. So let's say that two companies can borrow at the following rates. Company A can borrow fixed at 5% and floating at LIBOR, whereas Company B can borrow at 6% fixed or LIBOR plus 50 basis points floating. Before we continue, just make a note that you can see that Company A can borrow fixed and floating more cheaply than Company B. The key thing also, though, to note is that Company A can borrow fixed at 100 basis points or 1% less than Company B, whereas for floating, Company A can borrow at only 50 basis points less than Company B. We also want to assume that Company A wants to borrow at a floating rate and Company B wants to borrow at a fixed rate. The question is, how can we set up an interest rate swap so that it is mutually beneficial to both parties? We've already mentioned that Company A has a comparative advantage against Company B's borrowing rates, both fixed and floating. So because of that, and because the differential is slightly different, 100 basis points on the fixed and 50 basis points on the floating, we can arrange a mutually beneficial swap. First, we're going to get Company A to borrow at their lower fixed rate of 5%, whereas Company B will borrow at their floating rate, which you may recall is LIBOR plus 50 basis points. Company A will then pay Company B LIBOR on a predetermined notional amount, and Company B will pay Company A a fixed rate. And let's just say it's 5.25% on that same predetermined notional amount. In effect, Company A and B will each reduce their cost of borrowing by 25 basis points. Let's look at this in a bit more detail. So let's start with Company A. Recall that Company A's initial borrowing cost is 5%, but it actually wants to pay LIBOR. What it receives on the swap is 5.25%. So its net borrowing cost is ultimately LIBOR minus 25 basis points. So Company A is saving 25 basis points. Now let's look at Company B. Recall that Company B's original borrowing costs are LIBOR plus 50 basis points. However, they want to pay fixed, and they're paying 5.25%. They'll receive from Company A LIBOR, and when we net all of this out, what we're left with is that Company B can borrow at 5.75% when the original borrowing cost was 6%. So Company B also saves 25 basis points. That brings us to the end of this Introduction to Derivatives course. We look forward to seeing you on more capital markets courses. Bye for now.